This is an NBC News special report. Here's Chuck Todd.
Good day, everyone. We are coming on the air just moments before President Biden is set to announce that he's asking Congress to approve what the White House is calling a massive new ask for aid for Ukraine, a price tag of $33 billion. The funds would be used to fortify military, economic, and humanitarian assistance in that region for at least the next 5 months, as Ukraine fends off attacks from Russia. So with that, here is the president.
I just signed a request to Congress for critical security, economic, and humanitarian assistance to help Ukraine continue to counter Putin's aggression, and at a very pivotal moment. We need this bill to support Ukraine in this fight for freedom, and our NATO allies, our EU partners, they're going to pay their fair share of the cost as well, but we have to do this. We have to do our part as well, leading the alliance. The cost of this fight it's not cheap, but caving to aggression is going to be more costly if we allow it to happen. We either back Ukrainian people as they defend their country, or we stand by as the Russians continue their atrocities and aggression in Ukraine. Every day the Ukrainians pay for the price, and the price they pay is with their lives for this fight. So we need to contribute arms, funding, ammunition, and the economic support to make their courage and sacrifice have purpose so they can continue this fight and do what they're doing. It's critical this funding gets approved, and approved as quickly as possible. You know, long before Russia launched its brutal invasion, I made clear how the United States would respond. Predicted they would invade, and they surely did. We said we'd not send U.S. troops to fight Russian troops in Ukraine, but we would provide robust military assistance and try to unify the Western world against Russia's aggression. I said I would impose powerful sanctions on Russia, and that we destroy this myth that somehow they can continue to move without the rest of the world acting. That we deploy additional forces to defend NATO territories, particularly in the east along the Russian and Belarus borders. That's exactly what we said we would do, and we did. But despite the disturbing rhetoric coming out of the Kremlin, the facts are plain for everybody to see. We're not attacking Russia. We're helping Ukraine defend itself against Russian aggression. And just as Putin chose to launch this brutal invasion, he could make the choice to end this brutal invasion. Russia is the aggressor. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Russia is the aggressor, and the world must and will hold Russia accountable. Russia's continued assault is yielding immense human cost. We've seen them leave behind horrifying evidence of their atrocities and war crimes in the areas they try to control. And as long as the assaults and atrocities continue, we're going to continue to supply military assistance. And I might note parenthetically, you know, there's a dinner this weekend, Celebrate the Press. Think of what the American press has done. The courage is taken to stay in these war zones. The courage is taken to report every single day. I've always had respect for the press, but I can't tell you how much respect I have watching them in these zones where they're under fire, risking their own lives to make sure the world hears the truth. Imagine if we weren't getting that information. It'd be a different world. It'd be a different circumstance. In the past 2 months, Russia launched its brutal attack and has moved weapons and equipment to Ukraine. We've moved weapons and equipment to Ukraine in record speed. Thanks to the aid we provided, Russian forces have been forced to retreat from Kyiv. Doesn't mean they're not going to try to come back, but they've retreated thus far. We've sent thousands of anti-armor, anti-missiles, helicopters, drones, grenade launchers, machine guns, rifles, radar systems, more than 50 million rounds of ammunition. The United States alone has provided 10 anti-armor systems for every Russian tank that is in Ukraine, 10 to 1. We're providing Ukraine significant, timely intelligence to help them defend themselves against the Russian onslaught. And we're facilitating a significant flow of weapons and systems to Ukraine from our allies and partners around the world, including tanks, artillery, and other weapons. That support is moving with unprecedented speed. Much of the new equipment we've announced in the past 2 weeks has already gotten to Ukraine, where it can be put to direct use on the battlefield. However, we've almost exhausted what we call, the fancy phrase, the drawdown authority that Congress authorized for Ukraine in a bipartisan spending bill last month. Basically, we're out of money. And so that's why today, in order to sustain Ukraine as it continues to fight, I'm sending Congress a supplemental budget request. It's going to keep weapons and ammunition flowing without interruption to the brave Ukrainian fighters and continue delivering economic and humanitarian assistance to the Ukrainian people. This so-called supplemental funding addresses the needs of the Ukrainian military during the critical weeks and months ahead. And it begins the transition to longer-term security assistance that's going to help Ukraine deter and continue to defend against Russian aggression. This assistance would provide even more artillery, armored vehicles, anti-armored systems, anti-air capabilities that have been used so effectively thus far in the battlefield by the Ukrainian warriors. You know, and it's going to deliver much-needed humanitarian assistance as well as food, water, medicine, shelter, and other aid to Ukrainians displaced by Russia's war, and provide aid for those seeking refuge in other countries from Ukraine. It's also going to help schools and hospitals open. It's going to allow pensions and social support to be paid to the Ukrainian people so they have something in their pocket. It's also going to provide critical resources to address food shortages around the globe. Ukraine was one of the world's largest agricultural producers. It typically grows 10% of all the wheat that's shipped around the world. Putin has asserted sanctions are blocking food from Ukraine and Russia getting on the market, the sanctions we've imposed on Russia. Simply not true. Putin's war, not sanctions, are impacting the harvest of food and disrupting the movement of that food by land and sea to nations around the globe that need it. This funding is going to help ease rising food prices at home as well and abroad caused by Russia's war in Ukraine. It's going to help support American farmers produce more crops like wheat and oilseed, which is good for rural America, good for the American consumer, and good for the world. And this supplemental request will use the Defense Production Act to expand domestic production and the reserve of critical materials like nickel and lithium that have been disrupted by Putin's war in Ukraine and that are necessary to make everything from defense systems to automobiles. And I hope Congress will move on this funding quickly. I believe they will. I want to thank Congress, Democrats and Republicans, for their support of the people of Ukraine. And next week, I will be in Alabama to visit Lockheed Martin plant that manufactures the Javelin anti-tank missile we've been sending to Ukraine, and to thank the American workers, thank them for producing the weapons that help stop Russia's advances in Ukrainian cities like Kyiv. Their hard work has played a critical role in ensuring Putin's strategic failure in Ukraine, and they should know that we know it. In addition to this supplemental funding, I'm also sending to Congress a comprehensive package that will enhance our underlying effort to accommodate the Russian oligarchs and make sure we take their ill-begotten gains. We're going to accommodate them. We're going to seize their yachts, their luxury homes, and other ill-begotten gains of Putin's kleptocracy and the guys who are the kleptocracies. But these are bad guys. This legislative package strengthens our law enforcement capabilities to seize property linked to Russia's kleptocracy. It's going to create new expedited procedures for forfeiture and seizure of these properties. And it's going to ensure that when the oligarchs' assets are sold off, funds can be used directly to remedy the harm Russia caused in their help build Ukraine. Additionally, yesterday, Russia threatened two of our allies with a cutoff of energy supplies. While America has ended all Russian fossil fuel imports because we're able to use our vast supply of power in our country, some European countries have faced more challenges in reducing their reliance on Russian fuel. Russia has long claimed to be, quote, the reliable source of energy for the world. No matter what the differences are, their customers are always going to be in good shape. But these actions prove that energy is not just a commodity that Russia sells to help meet other countries' needs, but a weapon it will use to deploy against those who stand against their aggression. So let me be clear. We will not let Russia intimidate or blackmail their way out of these sanctions. We will not allow them to use their oil and gas to avoid consequences for their aggression. We're working with other nations like Korea, Japan, Qatar, and others to support our effort to help European allies threatened by Russia with gas, blackmail, and their energy needs in other ways. Aggression will not win. Threats will not win. This is just another reminder of the imperative for Europe and the world to move more and more of our power needs to clean energy. In the United States, we're doing that right now. Last year, we developed more solar, wind, and battery storage than any year in our history, enough to power 56 million American homes. Earlier this month, we acted to bolster the reliance on our nuclear energy facilities, which generates more than half of our carbon-free power. And we're just getting started. I look at this as a serious problem, but also an enormous opportunity, Bottom line, all these actions we've been taking are about this truth. Investing in Ukraine's freedom and security is a small price to pay to punish Russian aggression to lessen the risk for future conflicts. You know, throughout our history, we've learned that when dictators do not pay the price for their aggression, they cause more chaos and engage in more aggression. They keep moving. And the threats to America and the world keep rising. We can't let this happen. Our unity at home, our unity with our allies and partners, and our unity with the Ukrainian people is sending an unmistakable message to Putin. You will never succeed in dominating Ukraine. Finally, we're going to continue to deliver critical support to Ukraine. We must also not let our guard down in our fight against COVID-19 at home and abroad. That's why I'm again urging Congress to act on my request for $22.5 billion in emergency resources so the American people can continue to protect themselves from COVID-19. The reason we were so successful in the past is because I was able to work with drug manufacturers to order significant quantities of material we needed ahead of time to get in the front of the line. Without additional funding, we can't pre-order the amount of vaccines we need, and we risk losing our spot in line for vaccines that target multiple variants. We're running out of supply for therapeutics, like antiviral pills that we desperately need. Without additional funding, we're unable to purchase the life-saving treatment for the American people. We've donated more vaccines and treatments to the world than all other nations in the world combined. If the U.S. won't do it, no one else is really going to step up and do it. Without additional funding, the United States won't be able to help stop the spread around the world and close off ongoing sources of the supply chain disruptions. Look, let's get both of these critical tasks done. No delays, no excuses, just action, now. Now. Thank you all. Thank you.
Mr. President, what's your message to refugees on
Watch your head, man. You're going to get hurt. Just turn that camera on.
He's a gentleman. Mr. President, I wanted to ask what your message is to Ukrainian refugees on the southwest border and those that are trying to flee Ukraine from the violence.
We have made a direct means by which they can get from Europe, from Ukraine, directly to the United States without going to the southern border. In the meantime, in the southern border, we're trying to work through and make sure that it's an orderly process they're able to get in. But just so you know, we have said there's no need to go to the southern border. Fly directly to the United States. We set up a mechanism whereby they can come directly with a visa.
Mr. President, thank you. How worried are you by a growing number of Russian comments in the media and among some of their officials painting this conflict as actually already a conflict between NATO, the US, and Russia? They're painting in very alarmist terms, talking of nuclear weapons, saying it's a life or death struggle, etc. And just separately, or connected to that, Lavrov himself says it's already a proxy war, not a direct war, but a proxy war. So are either of those two things true, or do they worry you, those statements?
They're not true. They do concern me because it shows the desperation that Russia is feeling about their abject failure in being able to do what they set out to do in the first instance. And so I think it's more of a reflection, not of the truth, but of their failure. And so instead of saying that the Ukrainians equipped with some capability to resist Russian forces are doing this, they've got to tell their people the United States and all of NATO is engaged in taking out Russian troops and tanks, etc. So it's number one, it's an excuse for their failure. But number two, it's also, if they really mean it, it's no one should be making idle comments about the use of nuclear weapons or the possibility of the need to use that. It's irresponsible.
Mr. President, on that, Mr. President, Russia... Mr. President, back on the border, Title 42, a number of your Democratic friends are pressuring the White House to maintain that policy. Can you give us a straight answer whether you're going to heed that request or you're going to get rid of it?
I can give you a straight answer. We had proposed to eliminate that policy by the end of May. The court has said we can't so far, and what the court says we're going to do. The court could come along and say we cannot do that, and that's it.
Absolutely. Mr. President, you say that this is not a proxy war, but Russia clearly disagrees. They say that war means war. So how concerned are you that they may start to act accordingly, even if you disagree?
We are prepared for whatever they do.
What options do you have to ensure Poland and Bulgaria have sufficient supplies of gas?
First of all, as you know, Poland has indicated they have significant reserves of gas that they have planned for, as does, not as much, but as does Bulgaria. And we have worked with our allies from Japan on to say that we may divert our sale of the natural gas that we're sending to those countries and divert it directly to Poland and Bulgaria. So that's as much as I can tell you right now.
Sir, how concerned are you about a recession, given the GDP report today showed a contraction of 1.4% in the fourth quarter?
Well, I'm not concerned about a recession. And I mean, you're always concerned about a recession, but the GDP, fell to 1.4%. But here's the deal. We're also had last quarter consumer spending and business investment and residential investment increased at significant rates, both for leisure as well as hard products, number one. Number two, unemployment is the lowest rate since 1970. A record 4.5 million businesses were created last year. We're in a situation where we have a very different view than Senator Scott of Republicans who want to raise taxes on the middle-class families and want to include half the small business owners in that. So I think what you're seeing is enormous growth in the country that was affected by everything from COVID and the COVID blockages that occurred along the way. Now, you always have to take a look, and no one is predicting a recession now. Some are predicting there may be a recession in 2023. I'm concerned about it, but I know one thing, that, if our Republican friends are really interested in doing something about dealing with the economic growth, and they should help us continue to lower the deficit, which we've done last year over $350 billion. They should be willing to work with us to have a tax code that is actually one that works and everybody pays their fair share. And they should be in a position where you shouldn't be raising taxes on middle-class folks. You should be raising taxes on people who everyone acknowledges that the vast majority of Republicans aren't paying their fair share. I've said it 100 times. You have 50 major corporations of the Fortune 500 companies made $40 billion last year, didn't pay a single penny. No one under our proposal, making their $400,000 a year, will see a penny in their taxes go up, not one penny.
Mr. President, about tying COVID aid to Ukraine aid. Do you think COVID aid and Ukraine aid should be tied together in legislation?
Well, I don't care how they do it. I'm sending them both up. I mean, they can do it separately or together, but we need them both.
Mr. President, Majority Leader Schumer said yesterday that you're, quote, getting closer to using executive authority to cancel up to $50,000 in student loan debt. Can you confirm that? What exactly are you looking to plan to do here in the coming?
You mean my spokesman said that?
Majority Leader Schumer.
Yeah. Look, number one, first thing we did was reform the system that was in place that didn't work for anybody, that allowed people to write off debt if they engaged in public service. We have almost 1,785,000, don't hold me the exact number, I'll get the number, 700 and some thousand have had debt forgiven, their whole debt forgiven because of their working in either as teachers or other means by which they qualify. And we continue to make that easier. Secondly, I am considering dealing with some debt reduction. I am not considering $50,000 debt reduction, but I'm in the process of taking a hard look at whether or not there will be additional debt forgiveness, and I'll have an answer on that in the next couple weeks.
How high are you looking at?
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President.
We heard there President Biden taking a few questions, perhaps making or at least clarifying some news he had made on student loan debt. But let's focus on the big reason why we cut in for this. We've just announced, the president announced an additional ask of $33 billion. To put this in context, let me bring in our White House correspondent, Chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander. Peter, I did a little back of the envelope math here. We'd already done $13 billion in this war, this additional 33 over 5 months. So essentially, in the last 3 years of the war in Afghanistan, this country spent approximately $50 billion annually. So, Peter, we are on pace in a war that we're technically not the ones fighting to spend more on this war in Ukraine, for Ukraine, essentially we're financing this war, than we did in the last years of Afghanistan. That is a big, big ask of money. Peter.
Yeah, Chuck, that is a big number, more than twice the size of that most recent ask that the Congress approved and the president signed just a month ago of shy of $14 billion. This includes notably about $20 billion in weapons assistance, about half of that going directly to Ukraine. So that is a significant effort that the president is putting behind this ask right now, directly sending a message to Vladimir Putin and the Russians, in effect saying to them and to the Ukrainian people and the military forces there that the U.S. doesn't want this to end in a stalemate, that they want to see Russia weakened, that we have heard from some of the president's top aides, including the defense secretary, in the course of the last several weeks. There was a little bit of news here because obviously there's a process for this to get passed, Chuck. You'll remember that it was about 68. It was a bipartisan group of senators, lawmakers who supported this funding last month. The president this time around was saying he wanted new COVID funding to be tied to the funding to Ukraine. In a letter to Nancy Pelosi that was sent just today, the president said that they should be tied, but in his public comments here, the president backed away from that, saying he didn't care how it got done, that they could be done separately. That will make it much easier, if done separately, for Congress to quickly pass that aid to Ukraine. Chuck.
Well, a big wild card that wasn't mentioned at all that could still gum this up is Title 42, the issue at the border, but with the judge's ruling that may suspend the ability to do that, that actually could also clear some legislative hurdles on that front. Anyway, Peter Alexander, thank you. Today's move represents an important shift in strategy for President Biden, as Peter just mentioned, one highlighted by Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, who returned from Ukraine earlier this week. Let's take a listen to what the Defense Secretary said about weakening Russia.
That it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine. So it has already lost a lot of military capability and a lot of its troops, quite frankly.
So let's bring in our Pentagon correspondent, Courtney Kyiv. Courtney, first of all, I saw it was sort of a delayed reaction, but quite a few European leaders gave the New York Times some blind quotes, nervous about what Lloyd Austin said, worried that the U.S. was, sort of similar criticism that President Biden got a few weeks ago when he hinted at regime change and then they walked that back. Any sort of clarification from the Secretary on his comments about Russia?
No, we'll actually hear from him later today, though, so we have the opportunity to hear more about what he thinks about how the momentum may have shifted. But to Secretary Austin's point here on the Russian losses, we just heard from a senior defense official who said that the Russians now have 92 battalion tactical groups inside Ukraine dedicated to this fight in the Donbass area. It's in the southeastern part of Ukraine, and it has been moving very slowly. It's not fair at this point to say that it's stalled necessarily, but it's really a back and forth, literally day-to-day fight between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Sometimes the Russians moving forward a bit, then the next day the Ukrainians pushing them back. We also got a little bit more sense. You can look on that map right there. You see Mariupol in the southeastern part. We've heard a lot about that city just being bombarded and pounded by the Russians over the last several weeks. There is a very small amount of Ukrainian military resistance left there, but for the most part, the Russians have really taken over large parts of that city and have had it completely surrounded. We just heard from a senior defense official that some Russian forces have actually moved away from that city and may be moving northwest as part of this ongoing offensive in the southeastern part of the country. So that is significant. The big question is, do we see more Russian forces move out of there, and are they dedicated to taking over the Donbass area? But the reality is the Russians really do hold large areas in southern Ukraine right now. They have stepped up some of their movement and activity in the maritime environment as well. There hasn't been any kind of a large amphibious assault, but they have moved more naval forces in there. There's a belief that that could be about tying down the Ukrainian military in Odessa, another city that you see on the map right now, in the straight central southern part on the Black Sea. That is a critical port city to Ukraine. There's a belief that the Russians will try to take that in the coming days and weeks, but they have not really moved on that city yet. So again, the offensive in the southeastern part of the country continues, but the Russians really have not made a lot of movement. Part of that is because of these weapons that both the United States and many allies have been sending. We now know that about 60% of the howitzers, those large artillery guns that the U.S. has been providing, about 60% of those have moved in. There were 90 that have been dedicated. We expect more to be promised to the Ukrainians over the next coming days and weeks, now that we have this additional billions of dollars in presidential drawdown authority that the president has just announced today. We should also expect to hear about more ammunition heading to the Ukrainians in the coming days, Chuck.
Again, I don't think we fully appreciate how much of this war the United States is now financing. Courtney Kube at the Pentagon Force. Courtney, thank you. Let's check in inside of Kyiv. Our NBC News correspondent, my colleague Erin McLaughlin, she's been covering the conflict. She joins us from Kyiv. So, look, we know it's always the ask from Zelensky and the entire Ukrainian leadership is more, more, more. This is a response to that more. Obviously, this may be just a down payment.
Yeah, well, Ukrainian leaders are extremely thankful for the support that is now coming from the United States. They're repeatedly expressing their gratitude, and it's seen as absolutely essential, Chuck. You know, I thought it was telling as the president was outlining this request, the sirens went off here in the capital, a stark reminder that while Ukrainian forces managed to push out Russian troops back into Belarus, while they were successful in the battle for Kyiv, this war is still here. It's still affecting everyday life here in Kyiv, and the weapons from the West are seen as absolutely critical to this fight. You know, yesterday I was in the trenches of Kyiv, where they're still preparing for a possible Russian return. They were showing off their weapons. They showed us an NLAW, which was a gift from the British. It cost about $30,000 to $40,000 each, although they told us they prefer the American-provided javelins, that they were more effective. They also were firing off RPGs. And they told us point blank that without those weapons, without the assistance from the West, not just the weapons, but also the training, the medical advice as well, they would not have been able to push those Russians back into Belarus. So this is really seen as mission critical. And it's not just the military support, but the president also there outlined the economic support. It's hard to overstate just how devastating this has been to the Ukrainian economy. Since the beginning of the invasion, the GDP has fallen some 35%. The Ukrainian prime minister estimates that they need about $5 billion a month in assistance just to keep the government budget going. I was out in Irpin, war-ravaged Irpin, a suburb of Kyiv, earlier today, and I spoke to a man who owns a children's mall. It's a place that you'd want to take your kids on the weekend. It had bouncy castles. There's a pet, sort of a pet store in there. It's completely obliterated. He said when the Russians showed up, they just sort of devastated everything. He's lost everything, and he has no idea how he's going to rebuild. And so many Ukrainians right now are in that same position, which is why help from the West is seen as absolutely critical. Chuck.
Aaron McLaughlin in Kyiv for us, and Aaron bring up a good point. Look, a large chunk of this money is going to be dedicated to weapons and military aid, but there is a significant amount that is dedicated to humanitarian aid in country as well. Hopefully, more of Europe will also step up. We're going to have much more on these latest developments throughout the day on MSNBC, NBC News Now, and of course later this evening on the Nightly News. I'm Chuck Todd for all of my colleagues in Washington and in Kyiv. We're NBC News. Good day.